Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I thought today we would have a look at another user mission, which is a user model of the XF5U-1, the Flying Flapjack. Now this was created by Beckett. There will be a link in the description if you want to, have a go with it, and I just want to thank him for updating it to make sure that it works once again in War Thunder. So let's talk about the XF5U-1, we'll talk about its history and also its general use, but the main thing to understand, at least about the XF5U, the current version that you see before you, this one never properly flew. The furthest it got when it came to its actual use is that it had a few tests when it came to ground tests, so moving about and all of that stuff, but unfortunately it never got to a point where the vehicle was stable enough to actually be able to take off and go ahead with its general use. Now there is a version which was able to take off and all of that stuff, and we'll go through it as we go through the story of what is the XF5U. So obviously during World War II there was a ton of projects when it came to America, and when it came to American designs for planes, for tanks, whatever it was. There was a lot of funding put towards finding the next evolution when it came to aircraft design. Now obviously that eventually became jets, but at the start of the war, or during the mid-war, that wasn't always obvious. So you got many different designs, whether they be turbojet designs, flying wing designs, parasite fighters of course, with the Goblin, reconnaissance planes, 10-engine bombers. There was everything when it came from America. There was a ton of different prototypes, a ton of different ideas and innovations put forward, and for me it's just always exciting having a look through them. And of course the XF5U-1 was an amalgamation of another crazy idea, and it came straight from the Chance Vought division of the United Aircraft Corporation, and one man, Charles H. Zimmerman. Charles H. Zimmerman, if you don't know who he is, he was an aeronautical engineer who worked on many different projects when it comes to aircraft design, and he's probably most well known for this just because of the whole Vought XF5U and how weird and wonderful it is. But yes, Charles Zimmerman was the man completely behind this project and was the person who completely believed that it was feasible to do so. So obviously the Chance Vought company was well known for creating the F4U Corsair. This was the most capable carrier fighter flown by any nation in World War II. If you look at the statistics on the Corsair when it entered battle, if you look at its general stats, how well it did, the victories it was able to record, it was insane compared to other vehicles. And the Corsair even served into the 1970s for some other countries just to show how good the design was. But there had to be an extension, right? There had to be something after the Corsair, and this is where the F5U program came in. So the F4U was of course the Corsair, as you know. The F5U program was initiated in the mid-1939, so we're talking even pre-war from an American point of view, and Charles Zimmerman was tasked with creating some kind of design which would maintain a uniform airflow over an entire wingspan. So basically creating a whole plane which was a pretty much pancake design, and the aircraft would be able to take off and land at exceptionally low speeds and still have desirable high-speed performance. That's basically what he wanted to create, and this would be obviously very desirable for a Navy fighter, especially ones operating from aircraft carriers. Charles Zimmerman also mainly spent most of his career on the NACA, which is the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and then he eventually worked for NASA because that was the successor of course, the NACA. The aircraft design was as simple as this. So it was going to be a flat disc shape wing fuselage serving the aircraft's lifting service, and then you would have 2 piston engines buried in the body on each side of the cockpit. And these propellers would be the leading edge of this flat wing design. It was weird and wonderful, but the whole point of it was to promise high and low flight speeds with high angle attitudes for landing, takeoff, and other maneuvers. So the whole point was for general speed and also to try and keep it as compact as possible for naval carriers. Now, the fact is, when we also have a look at other parts of it, it would have the same, horizontal stabilizers, elevators, rudders, and also elevators at the midpoint of the fuselage that you see on other aircraft, just would look slightly different. Now, there is an aircraft that you probably know a lot about, or one which is brought up quite a lot, because this was the successful version, if you want to put it like that, and that was the V173. The V173 is technically the prototype of the prototype. It is the prototype of the XF5U, and it kind of shows that this style of design is capable of working. So Chancellor built a quarter-scale aircraft designated the V173. So as you can see, this was a quarter of the size of their overall design. It weighed 3,050 pounds. It was 1/5 of the weight of the full-size aircraft, and it flew for the first time on the 23rd of November 1942, and it obviously went through many wind tunnel tests, and one of the people who actually flew this aircraft was Charles Lindbergh, if you know who he is, and several other naval pilots. 131 hours of flight tests were successful, but the aircraft was deemed underpowered, but overall it seemed to work pretty well. The V173's tall undercarriage meant that the aircraft had a ground angle of 22 degrees, and the pilot entered the aircraft beneath the cockpit, which is kind of interesting. But one of the problems with the aircraft, similar to other vehicles that we've seen, such as the Bf-109, is because of that angle, the forward visibility of the aircraft was pretty much non-existent until the tail actually lifted the runway. This meant that there was extra danger when actually landing the machine and also taking off, and therefore transparent panels were provided between the pilot's feet for downward vision during landing to try and help that. And it was said that the 173 could take off within 200 feet and take off vertically into a 25-knot wind, which is kind of interesting to say. And by mid-1942, so we're about 2 to 3 years fully into this project, there was work which was put into an enlarged version of the 173, which would eventually become the proper prototype for the overall design that Zimmerman had created. So this eventually was named the XF5U-1, and in September of 1942 the Navy advised Vought of its intent to procure 2 of the planes, and the operational aircraft would be once again designed by Zimmerman, and they were looking for around about 425 miles per hour from the vehicle, and which would have improved engines and water injection over, of course, the prototype, and therefore it would be heavier, but it would be a hell of a lot more speedy as well. The engine arrangements presented by Chance Vought with the most serious problems of the aircraft's development program. So this was the main problem with them. They couldn't get the engines right on the full-scale model of the prototype, and because of this, the reason is the propellers themselves, they rotated in operation opposite directions, so they were contra-rotating. They were attached to shafts enclosed by circular nacelles, which extended forward from the fuselage, and because of the high angles of attack of the aircraft, which was intended to adopt these protracted periods, there was careful attention which had to be given to the design of the fuel and oil systems to ensure they would operate at all altitudes for the indefinite period. So you can see there was a lot going into this, which was not precisely new technology, but it had to be put into a way so the vehicle would be tip-top and in perfect shape. Otherwise, there was so much that could go wrong with it, and that was the main issue with it. It just got to a point where, if you compare it to a standard aircraft, the height of perfection, or the need for perfection on this aircraft, was way too high compared to others, so it was much harder to create what needed to. And so the XF5U, it had an angle of 18.75 degrees, so they reduced the overall angle that it sat at, and it was still very high though, and still gave it the same issues. The legs each had twin small diameter wheels on them. These folded upward and also aft into the lower fuselage, and an arresting hook would also be fitted for carrier operations, and it was once again another complex assembly that retracted and was enclosed by doors on it. The XF5U-1 was supposed to have 3 50 caliber machine guns mounted on each side of the cockpit, with a magazine capacity of 400 rounds per gun. The one that you see in game right now actually has provisions for 4 20 millimeters that is on the machine, and there was an actual provision for replacing 4 of the 50 caliber machine guns with 20 millimeters, but obviously this thing never flew, so therefore it never really had any use for the armament. There was also a place to carry 2 1,000-pound bombs on it, which would be carried under the fuselage. So eventually they built a wooden mock-up, and this was built on the 7th of June 1943. It was inspected at Stratford in Connecticut, and they decided to do some revisions on it, and it was approved in August. So even though the 2 aircraft contract was not signed until the 15th of July 1944, the overall realization of the machine had already started nearly a year earlier. So the first aircraft, it would have R2077 engines. These would have 1,350 horsepower for takeoff, and the second would have XR2002 ones, which had the Wright superchargers in them, so a lot of oomph behind them. The 16-foot diameter propellers were contra-rotating, as we talked about before, and they would turn outboard to avoid prop wash from disrupting the airflow over the wing and fuselage. The first XF5U, it actually rolled out of the assembly hall at Stratford in late June 1945. So at this point, we're talking about 6 years on this project, and it began its ground testing on the 20th of August. So the flight testing that it envisioned would start a year later. The second of the XF5U-1s would be used for static tests, and the flight test schedule was delayed because of difficulty obtaining the articulated propellers, which were not available until 1947, which was 8 years after the initial design of the project. And in addition to these issues, there were also vibration problems and issues with the complex gearbox, and this meant that the flight test never actually came about. And it wasn't just because of issues that the XF5U had. It wasn't just because of the fact that this thing really, didn't actually want to really fly too well because of the fact that they couldn't get the balance right of the aircraft. It was mainly because of other reasons. At this point, you're talking about an aircraft which is 8 years after the initial design. It was over time, it was over budget, and because of the end of the war, the Americans wanted to go in different directions compared to what they'd already seen before. We saw this in tanks. If you go and read Honeycutt's stuff, he talks a lot about the idea that basically straight after 1945 a ton of stuff was cancelled and they wanted to start anew with a bunch of new designs, and that happened when it came to aviation as well, but it came into the form of jets. The idea of jets was going to be the way forward. Piston engine aircraft or combat aircraft was seen as something of the past, or seen as something which would eventually go out of date, and they were completely correct about that. And guess what? The XF5U was one of these aircraft which was, of course, piston engined. So unfortunately, that's kind of the end of its story. kind of a sad whimper into history. There is a little bit about one of its prototypes, though. The prototype was transferred to the Smithsonian Museum for display, which was really nice. And the XF5U itself, the actual large-scale proper job model of what wanted to create, it was never actually, it was never actually given to a museum or anything like that. Instead, it was just destroyed, which is really sad. I wish that, we all have pipe dreams, right? And one of my pipe dreams would be to have a place where all of these prototypes would be collected and just kind of looked after. It would have been really nice to see this in real life, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Another little thing about the XF5U to finish off is they actually had to annihilate it with a wrecking ball to be able to destroy it, since it was so structurally solid. They couldn't just, they couldn't just annihilate it in other ways, which is a nice little feather in the cap, I suppose. Anyway, check out the user mission, have a bit of fun with it. I'd be surprised if we ever saw this in War Thunder, just because of the fact that it never flew, and there's so many other interesting options for America, but you never know, anything's possible. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I just want to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Chris Giltnane, Daniel Stanton, Jay Wilt, John Ryman, Martinez, Super Cacti, Trigger Hippie, Eugens Terry, and also Elove Goat and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.